everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Philosophy on International Aviation Law, hosted by Mar Gregorius College of Law. My name is Stephanie Sharon, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Our institution, Mar Gregorius College of Law, established in 2012, has now over 800 students and offers 4 different programs, which includes LLB integrated with BA or BBA or BCom, and also LLM. Situated inside the 130 acres campus of Mar Ivanios Vidyanagar, it is blessed with immense natural beauty and learning ambience with over 17 centers of excellence. It is today considered a new generation law school and proudly holds Institutional Excellence Award received in 2017 from Society of Indian Law Firms in partnership with Menon Institute of Legal Advocacy Training. Moving on, we are very excited and happy to have with us today our distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. S.D. Srijit, who is a professor and executive dean from Jindal Global Law School of OP Jindal Global University. Sir, we are more than honored to have you among us. I extend a heartwarming welcome on behalf of us all. I'd now like to invite our beloved principal, Professor Dr. John T.C., to welcome all. Sir, please unmute.
Hello.
Thank you, sir.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
It's audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, it's
Yes.
audible.
Yes. First of all, I welcome all participants to this webinar organized by Mar Gregorius College of Law, Thiruvananthapuram. This is the second webinar we are organizing in this academic year. In the first one, which was on professional avenues for law graduates, we provided an idea to the law graduates about the opportunities available to them or awaiting for them. Now we are unfolding certain areas of which students may know nothing or may not know anything about such areas. Today's topic for the webinar is Philosophy of Aviation Law. And the speaker is Professor Srijit, who is the Executive Director and Dean of Jindal Global Law School, affiliated to Jindal University, Sonpet, Haryana. After completing his LLB and MBL from University of Kerala, he joined Jawaharlal Nehru University for his MPhil in International Studies. And after that, he took LLD from University of Lapland, Sweden. After completing LLD, he joined there as a lecturer, then moved to Nuwals, Kochi, and from there to Kerala University, and finally to Jindal Global Law School. He is the author of a book titled Transcending Jurisprudence, a Critique of the Architectonics of International Law, published by the University of Lapland. He presented several papers in the international and national conferences and published several articles in national and international journals. And he is now holding the post of study group chair for Public International Law, International Association of Law Schools. And he is the winner of several awards. For example, Finnish Cultural Foundation Award, Finnish Lawyers Association Award, and several other awards also. I wholeheartedly welcome Professor Srijit to this webinar. Then many students are participating in this seminar. Many professionals are also participating in this seminar. Students, including engineering students, this aeronautical engineering and such other areas. Students are also participating in this webinar. I wholeheartedly welcome all participants to this webinar. Then I congratulate the coordinators, Srimati Jisamol, then Sushama George, and Riyaz Susan John, all three assistant professors of this law school for organizing this webinar. Once again, thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. A reminder, all of you can put forward your questions along with your name, year of study, and your college's name inside the Q&A box, and I'll make sure that they get addressed by our professor, Dr. S.G. Srijit, during the course of this session. And I also hope that no one is joined anonymously, as you will lose the chance to acquire the certificate. So please do log in using your name. I repeat, please do log in your name. Now, I hand over this platform to Professor Dr. S.G. Srijit to take over the session. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. You have all been very generous with words, and it's truly an honor to speak through this platform to the students and faculty members of Mar Gregorius College of Law. So the title of this lecture is, obviously you might have seen, the philosophy of international aviation law. In fact, it's not easy to capture a discipline whose antecedents can be traced back to 1919 Paris Convention in an hour. So I literally have to condense it by giving it a certain focus. So rather than presenting an overarching comprehensive philosophy of international aviation law, I would be rather making a case in point for a reimagination of the epistemological foundations of international aviation law. So as part of that process, I'll be touching some of the relevant provisions of the conventions, some of the standard and recommended practices, and including some of the standard operating procedures performed even inside a cockpit. But before that, I have to make a strong case as to why even those nitty-gritties become part of a branch of law, which we probably have named it as international aviation law. I must say that we probably have named it because the standard terminology used for this discipline since 1944 is actually international air law, or air and space law, where they found a coupling with another branch of public international law, international space law. So I'm trying to make a case in point to advance a certain epistemology with the nomenclature international aviation law. I'll put forward my reasons for that. So my entire effort would be to make a case in point, nothing beyond that. I mean, apologies that I cannot cover the discipline in its fine comprehensiveness. Number one, I've mentioned that this discipline has been known with the title International Air Law. And this has been reinforced by Professor Ruvantisa Aberadne in one of his brilliant articles published in American Journal of Jurisprudence with the title The Philosophy of Air Law. So he said that the foundations of international air law is based on a legal maxim: whoever owns the land, he owns it up to the skies. So the very notion of international air law is based on this notion of, or the central idea of ownership, which subsequently translated into the state sovereignty doctrine as the aviation became a state-centric, state-governed activity. So you can see that if you look at the first ever instrument, international law instrument drafted on aviation law or air law, it's a celebration of the state sovereignty doctrine. It says that every state shall have absolute sovereign rights over its airspace. There's a paradox here. International aviation requires trans-border, trans-jurisdictional action. And here you find a convention which actually celebrates or constrains actually the activities of the states by a celebration of the state sovereignty doctrine. So as Article 1 of the Paris Convention 1919 starts by a celebration of state sovereignty, so is Article 1 of the Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation, which governs modern international aviation. So it says that every state shall have absolute sovereign rights over its airspace. But the problem with the nomenclature international air law is that it limits aviation to all the activities performed in air. Moreover, when you say that it's international air law, generally in all the discourses, the sources of international air law can be traced back to Article 38(1) of the Statute of International Court of Justice, which is same as the sources of public international law. So international air law will have to emanate from conventions, custom, general principles of law recognized by civilized states, and writings of highly qualified publicists. This is absolutely fine as long as one deems international air law as a branch of public international law. But probably that civil aviation is much more than that. Civil aviation is much more than a celebration of a state sovereignty doctrine and to act within the constraints of that. So of late, there has been an effort to break free from the classical philosophy of public international law, the classical philosophy of international air law, to adopt a newer epistemology, which we can name as probably international aviation law. Now, if Once the nomenclature changes from international air law to international aviation law, what will be the sources here? Article 38(1) is certainly going to be redundant. So the reimagination also comes with a reimagination of the sources of international aviation law. And it's a very fine set of sources. International aviation law, if we are willing to recognize that branch of law as an epistemological category, then probably the sources of international aviation law will be all conventions, multilateral and bilateral. Second, standard and recommended practices, popularly known as SARPs in aviation law circles. And third one, standard operating procedures. Now, the scope of SARPs and SOAPs, the standard and recommended practices and standard operating procedures, is far more than what we can imagine. But we'll come to that in a moment. So what, in fact, the case I'm putting forward is actually a point of departure from this established classical notion, the classical epistemology of international air law, to a newer modernist approach to the discipline under the rubric international aviation law. So I've already mentioned that will prompt us to have newer set of sources. Let me go a little deeper into how do we envisage, how do we reconceive the sources of international aviation law. I've mentioned that all conventions, be that Paris Convention, be that Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation, be that Tokyo Convention on the crimes on board the aircraft, or be that the Montreal Convention on the liability of a carrier, all the conventions automatically will become part of the sources of international aviation law, because obviously all the standards, the normativity emanate from these conventions. But still, if you want to look at the conventions in a much more taxonomical sense, you can also find a fine classification here, that international aviation law can be broadly divided into two, public international air law and private international air law. So what is not public is private. So what is actually this private? All the activities governing liability of a carrier, including the baggage handlings, the passengers' rights, the claims, and the compensations, will automatically become part of the private international air law. There is a system that governs it. We call it the Warsaw system, which presently is governed by the Warsaw, along with the Montreal Convention 1999 on the liability of a carrier. So the point is that both the public and the private international conventions would become part of international aviation law, as it was part of international air law. As far as bilateral agreements are concerned, I would little bit shy away from calling that law, because we all know that these bilateral arrangements are much softer in nature. It's a softer normativity to these bilateral agreements. And moreover, bilateral agreements are more political arrangements between the states. There is a much deep-seated philosophy to the bilateral agreements, to which we'll come a little later. But yet, bilateralism is the way of civil aviation. Bilateralism is seen as modernism in international aviation law. So the number one source, or the first source of international aviation law, would be, or is actually, the multilateral and bilateral conventions. Second, I have mentioned the standard and recommended practices. Please note that Article 38(1) does not recognize SARPs as a source of law, because Article 38(1) was conceived in the during the 1919 and 1920, when the League was established. I mean, of course, we are not getting into the history of Article 38(1), but Article 38(1) does not have the scope or the stomach even to contain the standard and recommended practices based on which most of the international civil aviation is carried out. Now, what would form under SARPs? I would say that all the annexures, if you go by the official terminology of SARPs, all the 19 annexures of the Chicago Convention, which are made by the International Civil Aviation Organization through the SARPs making process, will be considered as SARPs. But actually, that's a very narrow definition of SARPs, which is only popular in the ICAO circles. All the guidelines issued by the national civil aviation bodies, for example, the Director General of Civil Aviation for India or the Federal Aviation Administration for United States, resolutions passed by various guilds and the guild federations, for example, International Federation of the Pilots Association, International Federation of the Air Traffic Controllers Association. Most important, recommendations of air crash investigation reports. I mean, this is extremely important, because if one is willing to have the broader perspective of deeming safety as the ultimate objective of international aviation law, securing safety as the objective of international aviation law, the recommendations, which are made in part 4 of the every air crash investigation report, would become a standard and recommended practices. Apart from that, other notifications issued by various regulatory bodies from time to time, including domestic legislations. Now, this is a little bit problematic, because Article 38(1) of the Statute of ICJ recognizes domestic legislations under Article 38(1)(c), general principles of law regulated by civilized states. But under the newer imagination, international aviation law, domestic law would become standard and recommended practices. If one is willing to see things from a very Austinian, formalistic perspective, I would say that there is no better way to enforce the SARBs. There is no better way to overcome the suppleness and softness of the SARBs than incorporating this in the domestic legislations. The classic example is United Kingdom. Most of the standard and recommended practices, including some of the recommendations made by the air crash investigation reports, have become domestic legislations. The classic cases, some of the domestic legislations enacted after the Lockerbie incident in 1989. So the number one sources, as I've mentioned, conventions, bilateral and multilateral, standard and recommended practices, SARBs. But please note, we have given a much broader approach to SARBs. But strictly speaking, in the legal discourse or in the ICAO circles, SARBs simply mean the 19, or probably in future there will be more annexures, the 19 annexures of the Chicago Convention. I'll talk a little bit more about these annexures. Well, annexures simply mean that they set softer standards for international aviation to follow. They are mainly in the interest of the safety. The annexures range from operation of an aircraft, operations of aircraft, to how aerodromes will have to be designed, how environmental standards will have to be maintained, how sustainable aviation can be achieved, how safety can be achieved, how investigations can be carried out, how air traffic controllers will have to organize navigational and other systems. Extensive details can be found on how to operate a flight or how safer aviation can be achieved if one is willing to take the annexure seriously. The problem with Article 38(1) and the classical approach of international air law is that it pays scant attention to the SARBs. Rather, it would like to focus on the mainland of the Chicago Convention, especially the provisions which are generally deemed to be hard law, which are generally deemed to be part of the convention. Annexures are paid scant attention, but it is actually through the annexures that the routine civil aviation happens. So we have conventions, bilateral and multilateral. We have SARBs, the standard and recommended practices. And the third important source, which of course is a very radical imagination for aviation law, is that the standard operating procedures. Now, SOPs have a much broader mandate. They are not just limited to, the takeoff procedures or the landing procedures, but if you read the operations manual of aircraft, be that operations manual of SpiceJet or operations manual of Air India or operations manual of British Airways, you will find that operations manuals are based on the standard and recommended practices. No operation manual can be in serious breach of the SARBs laid down in Annexure 19. So in that sense, if you're willing to have a broader approach to read aviation law, a lawyer can read the operations manual of an aircraft with the same vein as they read the Constitution of India, or with the same vein as they read the Chicago Convention. So operations manual, of course, they're very extensive. They run into thousands of pages. In most of all the airplane cockpits, you can find the operations manual. So operations manuals range from in aerodrome procedures to in-flight procedures, including cockpit etiquettes and some of the shibboleths. For example, I mean by cockpit etiquettes, the etiquette that the takeoff thrust shall be jointly given by the captain and the first officer. Some of the jargons like I have the control, you have the control, the jargon like rotation, rotation when the plane reaches its takeoff speed. So these kind of cockpit jargons and the cockpit etiquettes and even some of the cockpit shibboleth actually become part of international aviation law when one takes a broader approach. So what you need is actually that scholarly courage to depart from the classicism of international air law and to embrace this newer epistemology, international aviation law. So the first point of departure towards a philosophy of international aviation law is actually a reimagination of the very source doctrine, which is incorporated in Article 38(1) of the Statute of ICJ, and adoption of this newer source, the three-tier source, convention, SARBs, and SOAPs. Now, is there a necessary hierarchy in terms of the way in which the sources are organized? I would say yes. The normativity still continues to emanate from the conventions, because the conventions are not nullified. Conventions still continue to be the source of the entire normative framework. Based on the convention, standard and recommended practices are formulated, including the recommended practices beyond what ICAO formulates. I'm saying the guidelines of DGCA or the guidelines of FAA, the guidelines of the professional guilds. The standard and recommended practices actually turn into what you call the SOPs, the standard operating procedure. If you want to reinforce this understanding, next time when you fly your plane, pull out that safety card, which is a legal document. Definitely you have to read through the safety document, but look at what is written in a tiny script at the bottom. You will find that there will be reference to a DGCA notification and a letter of exchange between DGCA and the airline. That means that the airline is in compliance with or the standard operating procedure for safety, including buckling your seatbelt, including opening the emergency door, including evacuation, which is provided in the safety card, which you will find behind your seat pocket, which you found in your seat pocket is actually in compliance with the standard and recommended practices issued by the National Civil Aviation Authority, which is DGCA in India's case. So you see that how broader the mandate, how broader the epistemological scope of the discipline would become when you are willing to depart from the classicism of international air law and move to international aviation law. Now, let me briefly tell you how this legal architecture, this grand legal architecture of international aviation law is organized. There are numerous conventions. I've mentioned about it, apart from SARPs and SOAPs. The oldest convention is the 1919 Paris Convention. Of course, Paris Convention only caters to primitive aircraft, the aircraft which was mainly used during the First World War. But you will see that in the Paris Convention too, you can find some kind of a cynicism, because on one side you are trying to create a trans-border activity like aviation, and on the other side, some kind of an obsession to jealously guard your state sovereignty, jealously guard your borders from the interference of other planes. I would say that this is mainly because of a tragedy. This is mainly because of the devastation enfiladed by the aeronautical might during the First World War, that the 1919 Paris Convention decided to start by reinforcing the sovereign rights of a state, rather than talking about the trans-border nature of civil aviation. Even though the ICANN is a body called International Civil Aviation Commission, which was established under the Paris Convention, continued to draft a much newer convention to suit the needs of the modern civil aviation. The Second World War further hit the aviation sector badly, and again, the drafters decided that we'll remain cynical about civil aviation, and any civil aviation is possible only after celebrating, after reinforcing the state sovereignty doctrine. That's exactly the reason why Chicago Convention 1944, which governs the modern civil aviation, starts by saying that every state will have absolute sovereign rights over its airspace. I'll come back to the Chicago Convention a little later, but this is the parent convention. Anybody who wants to understand international aviation law, you need to read the Chicago Convention. Towards the end of my talk, I'll also tell you that how can we reimagine our own way of reading the Chicago Convention, because now Chicago Convention has to be read in the light of the newer epistemology, international aviation law. Apart from Chicago Convention, I've mentioned that there is a set of legislations which govern a crime against an aircraft, including crime on board aircraft. So first one is the Tokyo Convention. All the crimes on board an aircraft, including hijacking, unruly behavior of the passengers, they are all governed by the Tokyo Convention of 1963. Interesting thing is, these are not the names of this convention. The conventions have much bigger names, but in international aviation law or in public international at large, we have this habit of giving nicknames. So Tokyo Convention 1963 means Tokyo Convention prohibiting crimes on board aircraft. Next is a Hague Convention 1970, which prevents all activities relating to hijacking, other words called unlawful seizure of aircraft. Montreal Convention of 1971 is about all unlawful activities against a civilian aircraft. And the most recent one is the Beijing Convention 2010, which talks about, again, unlawful activities against a civil aviation. But the scope of the Beijing Convention has been substantially broadened to include terrorist activities. Because the Beijing Convention, or the initiative for the Beijing Convention, mainly started in the aftermath of September 11 incident in the United States. So we have the Chicago Convention, which is sort of a parent overarching convention. We have certain conventions that govern criminal activities, prohibition of criminal activities on board or against aircraft. And the third one is, as I've mentioned, the private international air law. Now, private international air law is a little tricky branch because it's simply, it is not really the public international law conventions. The entire private international air law is about unification conventions. For example, like Warsaw Convention 1929 is the parent convention which actually unifies all the liability regimes, liability for damages caused by the carrier during the flight. it's a consolidation of all that in the Warsaw Convention 1929. There is a long history to that. Warsaw Convention started from 1929. Ultimately, it climaxed in the modern convention, the Montreal Convention of 1999. But there are so much of happenings without that. I do not have time to narrate that entire history that actually requires 10 classes, because Warsaw Convention itself needs probably 2 or 3 classes to explain. But I'll simply tell you this. Warsaw Convention was in 1929. You know that in 1929, airline was in its infancy. In the 30s, that the major airlines began to come to the forefront. By 1955, some sort of a primitiveness began to be felt by the drafters, and they decided that we'll now move forward with reimagining the Warsaw Convention, and then the Hague Convention 1955 came. After Hague Convention 1955, there was a Guadalajara Convention, there was a Guatemala Protocol, there were 4 Montreal Conventions. I'm not getting into the details, but I'll tell you what exactly is this historical evolution. The effort on the part of the airlines were to be free from the lawyers. They really wanted a regime which is free from the lawyers. That means that through Hague, through Guadalajara, through Guatemala, through Montreal, what they mainly tried was that airlines were happy to create an absolute liability regime up to certain amounts, say $75,000 or 1 lakh US. Only beyond that, they wanted the lawyers. The fundamental concern was that if it's a fault-based liability rather than an absolute liability, the matter will have to be decided in a court of law. And imagination of the judges, ran wild, because of which many airline industries, including many airlines, will have to pay hefty compensation to the passengers. So to cut the story short, the main reason why Warsaw evolved through Hague 1955, Guadalajara, Guatemala, and Montreal is mainly because they want to keep the system out of the lawyers. So to keep the lawyer away, and ultimately let's create a regime of torts without lawyers. So even today, the international, as far as liability is concerned, up to a certain limit, there is absolute liability. You prove the damage, you get the liability. You can litigate the matter as per the Warsaw Convention only when it crosses a certain limit, and that limit is extremely higher level. I mean, the limit has been set at an extremely high threshold that seldom one would feel the need to involve lawyers. Now, please note that there are numerous compensation cases disputed in the court, and courts have been giving decisions on that. None of those decisions would become part of international aviation law. So I'm just now telling the limitations of aviation law. So all the compensation claims settled by the court would simply become part of the law of liability or the law of torts. It will not become part of international aviation law. Now, some of the works performed in the law firms. Procurement contract relating to aircraft. Well, please note that this is not part of international aviation law. This is part of, this is part of law of procurement. If there is a merger of 2 airlines, it's not within the scope of international aviation law. That's part of this super specialization within company law, what we call as the mergers and acquisition. So please understand that international aviation law still would continue to remain a branch of public international law, irrespective of how badly the discipline has been fragmented. So international aviation law would continue with its loyalty to public international law, excluding what the items I've mentioned. So if you join a law firm in order to do international aviation law, you will only be dealing with those cases where aviation is a subject matter. So you can do that with the same vein as you do with the merger of 2 insurance companies, or you do with the merger of 2, postal corporations. So aviation's just become a subject matter there. That's not part of aviation law. So most of the work performed in the law firm, mergers and acquisitions, drafting commercial contracts for airline procurement, they don't form part of international aviation law. They are part of that respective branch of law. So now I'm coming back to this question, why should you reimagine international aviation law? I've already mentioned that it will bring in newer sources like SARPs and SOAPs, which are actually the bread and butter of international aviation law. But apart from that, the most important thing is that you will be able to break free from a certain classicism. That classicism is the sadistic obsession we have with the state sovereignty doctrine, because even now state sovereignty doctrine, as it is applied in public international law, is what it was conceived by Hugo Grotius and the Emerite Vattel. That Vattelian ghost, the Grotian ghost, still continues to haunt the minds of public international lawyers. I'll give you a case towards the end of my talk, the ban on the Gulf ban on the Qatari flights, how the state sovereignty doctrine was misused in order to sabotage the airline industry. I'll come to that a little later. So what are the other advantages of this new imagination, advantages of this new epistemology, other than enriching the source doctrine? In a never before manner, our shift is going to focus on annexures. I mean, as I've said that a public international lawyer with the kind of training they have got is tend to read or tend to live in the mainland of the Chicago Convention, paying scant attention to the annexures. I've mentioned that annexures are extremely rich resources. I mean, annexures generally do not speak to the stakeholders. Annexures do not speak to the enforcers. For example, annexures do not speak to a pilot, but actually annexures speak to the pilot in the form of the standard operating procedure. But the advantage of the annexures is that when you focus on annexures, you will see that there are so many silent subjects in international aviation law. The normative public international law approach of international air law has silenced these subjects. For example, no law school or nowhere when in textbooks we read about the legal status of a pilot in command or what are the roles and responsibilities of a co-pilot. Rather, we would prefer to read Article 31 and 32 of the Chicago Convention, which says that there shall be proper licensing requirements for the pilots. And if these licensing requirements are not followed, other states can ban the entry of your planes into their sovereign territory. Now we read it with this vein and actually we cut a big story short. But focus on the annexures will actually bring in new actors who were hitherto silenced. Annexures talk about the roles and responsibilities of cabin crew. Annexures talk about the roles and responsibilities of a captain and also a first officer. So let's look at that. How the focus on annexures are going to enliven or relive these silent ones. So first of all, let me talk about a very interesting concept, captain. Well, of course, there is no such terminology called a captain in aviation law. Captain is an airline terminology. In aviation law, we only use one terminology, pilot in command. So the pilot designated by the operator, or in case of general aviation, the owner who's in command of the plane and charged with the safe conduct of a flight is often called as a pilot in command. In the most simplest terminology, pilot in command is the one who's generally designated by the airline as a captain and the lady or the gentleman who will be occupying the left seat of a cockpit. Well, you know that the captain always will have to sit on the left-hand side of the cockpit. Now, international aviation law doesn't talk much about the pilots. But if you look at the annexures, you will see that even among the captain, who will be designated as a captain also is a very complex thing. So probably that if you have ever seen this, the case of Qantas 32, there is a beautiful book by Captain Richard Rippenny. And as per that book Q32, the Qantas 32, that plane whose engine, a part of the engine flew off after takeoffs from Singapore, had actually 5 captains in the cockpit. There was a captain, 5 members in the crew. There was a captain, there was a check captain, there was a supervisory check captain, there was a first officer, and there was a second officer. So 5 members. Now, who is actually the captain? Because the supervisory captain and the supervisory check captain are always seniors to a captain. So who will be the ultimate decision-making authority within a cockpit, whether to land back in Singapore, whether to continue with the flight, or whether to declare an emergency? Who will take the decision? Well, it's always the individual who's designated by the airline as the captain. So irrespective of the seniority, it will be the one who has in the duty sheet, if it is written that it's the captain will be responsible for the entire decision making within the cockpit. Now, please don't underestimate the role of a captain. If you read Tokyo Convention, you will see that magisterial powers are vested upon a captain, including the right to arrest a person and hand over to the law enforcement authorities. We'll come to that very soon. So, but Annexure 6, I mean, this is the annexure which talks about, operations of aircraft. Annexure 2 talks about the rules of the air. So if you read Annexure 6, it has a beautiful clause. Let me harp a little bit upon it. Annexure 6, para 2.4 has a beautiful statement which reads that the pilot in command of an aircraft shall have final authority as to the disposition of the aircraft while in command. Now, this term disposition is very intriguing because we generally don't use the expression disposition to inanimate objects like a plane. So why the expression disposition is incorporated in the law? Because para 2.4 of Annexure 6 is the law. So in simple words, the captain shall have absolute authority over the dispositions of an aircraft. I can understand if in an elephant management manual, if it says that the mahout will have absolute authority over the dispositions of the elephant, I can understand that. But in the convention, they use the expression disposition. I would say that this is a beautiful provision which actually celebrates a romance between the captain and the plane. How the romance comes from where the romance comes actually. The romance comes from the physics of flying. Nobody knows the aircraft as the captain. I mean, there is a hidden silent romance happening when the pilot flies the plane. For example, the physics of flying includes the rudder movement given by the pilot even during a takeoff. It can also be related to the post-takeoff yaw, during a roll. When the plane makes a roll, a right roll or a left roll after a takeoff, the plane's nose is going to make a yaw is only known to the captain. To what extent the yaw will go, when the yaw will happen, only the captain knows it. This is why Article 2.4 or the Para 2.4 of Annexure 6 celebrates that romance between captain and the plane. Now let me go back to a couple of incidents. You all know the movie Sully, whereby the captain Leslie Sullenberger had a crippled aircraft, a plane absolutely crippled. Both engines were blown off because of a bird strike. Air traffic controller asked the captain to return to the runway, but the captain switched off the transponder and decided to defy, breaking all conventions, decided to defy the standard operating procedure that you should hear to the air traffic controller. He decided to exercise his authority as a captain and decided to ditch in River Hudson. But please note that when he decided to ditch, he followed the standard operating procedure for ditching. Even though he defied the order of the air traffic controller, he decided to ditch. Why did this happen? Because as per Para 2.4, captain alone knows how the aircraft is going to behave. So international air law won't tell you this, but if you read the Annexure 4 with a fine sense of irony, with a fine sense of aesthetic beauty, you are going to understand that there is a romance between captain and the plane. So Leslie Sullenberger is a classic case. We know that Captain Sullenberger saved the life of 150 passengers and the crew because he decided to ditch. Had he not decided to ditch, probably the plane would have probably crashed somewhere in the outskirts of the runway. The same case, you all might have heard about this case. If not, hear it now. The case of the Gimli glider, whereby Captain Robert Pearson of a Canadian Airways, he lost the complete hydraulic controls over the plane, the absolute hydraulic power loss due to fuel exhaustion. He landed the plane not in an airstrip, but in a sports strip. Or in a sports ground or in a car strip, I believe, in a racing strip, actually, he landed the plane using a movement which can be called as forward slip. Now, please note that forward slip is an extremely dangerous movement whereby the plane's nose will almost be pointing towards the ground in a 45-degree angle. It's an extremely dangerous maneuver, but the captain performed that in order to create the drag because the flaps were not working. He had no other alternative. Even though he put the landing gears down, the captain had no other way to land the plane. Look at that. Why did Captain Robert Pearson took that decision? Because he knew the disposition of the plane. Even though I use the expression of mahout and an elephant, that's exactly the romance between the captain and his plane. There are many captains who have nicknamed their planes like Zulu. You know, the Ethiopian airline 953, which had a tragic crash, the pilots used to call that Zulu, a Boeing 767. So this romance between the pilot and the plane is actually recognized by the law. Now you may think, is it just a fancy or do we need to take this romance seriously? Indeed, when there is an investigation against a captain, when the liability is going to be on the pilot, when the pilot error is going to be proven, it is at that point that Para 2.4 comes to the aid of a pilot to prove that he acted based on, in law of tort, we all know this principle, Bolam principle. The Bolam principle that what was reasonably possible can be done by the captain exercising the Para 2.4. So Para 2.4 gives a lot of legitimacy to the radical actions performed by a pilot in order to save the aircraft. Now you might have seen by now from whatever I have talked so far, we are trying to make a big shift from sovereignty being the foundational doctrine of aviation law to safety being the foundational doctrine. Safety has to be the super norm, not really the celebration of a classic British Anglo-Indian, Anglo-Saxon doctrine or Roman doctrine, which has to be today governing the international aviation law. Now, moving further, the captain's powers are not limited to that. I simply thought of talking about that, but you know that understanding Annexure 6 and Annexure 2 will create more empathy towards these people in whose hand we vest our safety. They do a great job. You have to understand that there are 100 ways a flight can go wrong, but there is only one way everything can get right. So every safe landing by a pilot is actually 100 things getting right, or everything rather, 1,000 things or 10,000 things getting right. Annexure, you might have heard about this famous air series Mayday, and you might have heard that pilots often call this Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Now, pilots don't do this out of their whims and fancies. Pilot will have to do this because it is required by Annexure 6 of the Chicago Convention that when a plane is in distress, the pilot will have to make the call Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. It cannot be one Mayday, it has to be 3 Mayday, 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 Mayday. And after that, the pilot will have to press the transponder 7700 when the plane is in danger. There are numerous guidelines like that given to the captain. So, for example, if it is a fuel emergency, the captain shall not simply say Mayday, 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 but the captain will have to say Mayday fuel, Mayday fuel, and Mayday fuel because it's a fuel emergency. You are running out of fuel. So look at that. These things which are routinely performed in a cockpit has its legitimacy in the law, which we study in the law school. In Chicago Convention, in the annexures of the convention, you find it. Not only that, even that the way in which the cabin briefing, the safety briefing is done in a cabin by the stewardess, that also is articulated in Annexure 6 of the Chicago Convention, and that's exactly performed based on that. Now, I mean, these annexures do evolve through various incidents and various accidents. The case of Avianca 1952, the plane had a fuel emergency, but the Spanish-speaking captain and the, you know, and what say the captain and the first officer who's handicapped in his English could not effectively convey that they have an emergency. Rather, they went on to say that we need a priority. And this is an offensive term, a pejorative term for air traffic controllers, because no plane can be given a priority, no matter whether you are the leading airline in the world. But Avianca was repeatedly asking for priority, because in Spanish, priority, when you translate priority into English or emergency into English, that simply means a priority. Now, the pilot, instead of saying we need a priority, should have immediately declared an emergency by pressing the transponder and also by calling Mayday. There are further things. If it's a crisis which can be surmounted, you don't need to go for a Mayday call. You can always say pan, 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 pan. 3 times pan, pan means that there is an urgency, but of course it is probably something which we can surmount. So there are a lot of cases whereby the pan, pan would be converted into a Mayday when it becomes unsurmountable for the pilots. There are many other ways of signaling the urgency as well, by switching on and switching off the landing lights, or by calling the pan, pan, pan. Now, the reason why I mentioned all this is that, look at that, there are certain subjects of international aviation law which are overlooked because of the grandiose discourse we generally present in the form of international aviation law. Too much of state centricism, too much of imagination focused on state sovereignty, that we miss these vital things actually which keep the aviation law alive. A little bit more on the captain. I've mentioned that Article 5 to 10 of the Tokyo Convention gives the commander of an airplane with magisterial powers, including when to land, when to throw a passenger out, and you know, whether there's a medical emergency on the plane, when to land, etc. Such powers are also vested upon a captain. So Tokyo Convention mainly says that whenever there is a crime on board a plane, the crime can even be an unruly passenger, a misbehaving passenger, the plane can actually land. Whether to land the plane at the cost of burning fuel is a decision which the captain will have to take, because a plane which is heavy has taken off to fly from Delhi to Frankfurt, and if the plane has to make an emergency landing, the captain will have to jettison many gallons of fuel of the plane. So whether to jettison that in the interest of the safety of a passenger or not is a call which the captain will have to take. So the captain often faces with the principles of tort, like Bolam principle. What can be reasonably done under that circumstances? Life of a passenger is valuable, or the gallons of fuel which have been pumped into the airline or into the aircraft. These are the calls which a captain will have to take. Now there is another individual, and if you look at, I mean, I would say those who are interested to know more about the duties and responsibilities of a pilot, how the law translated into SOP, I have found the operations manual of the SpiceJet having an academic quality, because a lawyer can read it with the same vein as they read the Chicago Convention. SpiceJet has given extremely detailed guidance on how the standards and recommended practices in the Chicago Convention has translated into, or how that can be translated into the flight operations manual. Well, I'm not getting into those details. But there is another individual who's actually the shadow of a captain. We call him the co-pilot or the first officer. Now, if you read the Chicago Convention, there is absolutely zero reference to a co-pilot. Even you scan through the annexures, you conduct a raid of the annexures from Annexure 1 to Annexure 19, you will find only one reference to the co-pilot, which says that what shall be the frequency of the radio, which will be on the ears of a co-pilot. Now, this is a little tragic, because an individual who plays an equal role in a democratic decision making that happens within a cockpit is absolutely silenced in the Chicago Convention. But there are many domestic legislations. There are many guidelines issued by the civil aviation bodies whereby the legal position of a first officer, or whom we call as a co-pilot, is articulated. One of the best article ever written on this is by Kane and Payne, called "The Legal Status of a First Officer" in the famous journal by Kluwer, Air and Space Law. So, who is a co-officer? Who is actually a first officer? We generally say that, well, first officer is the legal shadow of the captain. Nothing more than that. But actually, first officer has been given certain responsibility. Number one, query the command. Every decision taken by the captain can be queried by the first officer. And if the first officer queries it and the first officer has a disagreement with the decision, the captain will have to go by a democratic process. But please note that the captain also has the authority to overrule the first officer. I mean, there are instances whereby first officers were not consulted, but I mean, you might notice one crash which you're all aware of, the crash that happened in the Mangalore way back in 2011 or 2013, I believe, the crash that happened in Mangalore, whereby the first officer suggested the captain for a go round, but the captain actually declined or refused to heed to the query, the command queried by the first officer, and of course, we know that it was a tragedy. So the cockpit resource management, which is actually the lessons or the academic instruction which the pilots get before the flying, which also becomes part of international aviation law, gives clear guidelines as to how democratic decisions shall be taken within a cockpit. So first of all, there is need for a dialogue between captain and the first officer. The golden rule is not about who is right. It is about what is right. Because when what is right is heeded to, the plane will have a safer landing. It will ensure safety of the passengers. Critique can be seen as a sign of effective performance, not a sign of being skeptical or being cynical about the decisions of the captain, but everything can be critiqued within a cockpit. Critiquing means, again, it forms under the command, the query. Ultimately, no matter whatever is the decision, whether the decision of the first officer prevails or the captain's decision prevails, safety has to be the super norm, the paramount norm of international aviation law. So this again calls for a departure from international air law to international aviation law. So you have seen that new actors have come into place. Let me go through quickly. Another major element which is overlooked by international air law is air crash investigation. Well, whenever there is a crash, all eyes and ears turn towards investigation. Now, please note that there are clear guidelines laid down in the Annexure 13 of the Chicago Convention as to how an air crash investigation will have to be carried out. If you read the Chicago Convention, I'm saying the main body of the Chicago Convention, there is only an Article 26, which says that investigation will always be conducted by the state in whose territory the crash happened. Now, this is a very interesting proposition. The question is that when a Saudi Arabian airline and a Kazakhstan airline had a mid-air collision and both the planes fell into Indian territory, why should India conduct an investigation expending the taxpayers' money for that investigation? This is the question which often comes up when it comes to determining the Article 26 state, because the state on whose territory the crash happened shall conduct the investigation. There is some paradox here because India is a third party. India has no interest in that. It's actually a mid-air collision that happened between Saudi Arabian airline and Kazakh airline, but India conducted the investigation. DGCA conducted the investigation. The reason is simple. It's number one, civil aviation is a matter of universal interest. It cannot be limited to that of a state. Safety is paramount for aviation. Safety is not limited to safety of Saudi Arabia, safety of Qatar, safety of Kazakhstan, safety of India. It is safety all through. Most important, access to the crash site. You know that our states jealously guard the boundary. It may not be possible for the investigating agency of Saudi Arabia or the investigating agency of Kazakh or a third investigating state which has been given the responsibility to penetrate into Indian borders and conduct the investigation. Accessibility is the primary reason why the state on whose territory the crash happened will have to conduct the investigation. Well, this mainly happens when, the crash is on a third site. It doesn't happen as in the case of the crash that happened in Calicut Airport at Kozhikode. That's mainly because it's an Indian plane, Indian territory. Now, investigation, the provisions relating to aircrash investigation has often become very problematic. In the case of Malaysia 370, the missing plane, we still consider the plane as crashed. There is no Article 26 state because we do not know, first of all, where the crash happened. It is believed that the crash happened on the high seas. Who will conduct the investigation? So Annexure 13 lays down that in such a case, investigation will always be conducted by the flag state. Further, Annexure 13 gives the right for the operating state, the flag state, the state which participated in search and rescue operations, the state whose citizens suffered maximum fatalities, and most important, the manufacturer can also take part in the investigation because there is nobody better than Boeing to tell why Boeing 737-800 MAX or what is problematic with Boeing 737-800 MAX. So detailed guidelines are provided in Annexure 13 as to how to conduct an investigation, which is generally overlooked by international air law. But let me tell you a little bit about some interesting facets of investigation. There was a crash in the United States, an American plane TWA-800, which took off from New York bound to France in 1996, crashed over the American territorial waters. There were rumors that it was a case of mistaken identity whereby the plane was shot down by the American Navy, mistaking it as a belligerent plane or something of that sort. It was a case of mistaken identity. Immediately, I mean, you know that as per the rule, investigation will have to commence. So there is no question here. United States territory, United States plane, American citizens, by all intents and purposes, America will be the investigating state. So immediately, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB of United States, started the investigation. But at that point, there was some kind of a conspiracy theory going on. Conspiracy theory was going around that this is actually a crash. This is not really a crash, an accident, but it was actually a case of mistaken identity whereby the plane was shot down. Immediately, if there is a crime, it is actually the federal FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which will have to conduct the investigation, not NTSB. So if you look at TWA 800, I'm omitting many of the details here, there was a kind of friction between Federal Aviation Administration and NTSB, between NTSB and Boeing, and also between NTSB and Federal Bureau of Investigation. Finally, the matter was settled after much deliberation by way of a federal regulation that National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, will have predominance over FBI in all cases. But if the agent general and the NTSB chief agree that there is a criminal activity involved in the crash, investigation will have to be handed over to the to the FBI. Now, please note that this is a case of United States, whereby friction between two agencies arose because everybody was laying their claim on this particular investigation. And also, the missile was a conspiracy theory. So there is a lot of politics surrounding that, which is beyond the scope of this talk. I'm simply saying that TWA 800 was brought to a logical conclusion when it was found that there was a spark in the fuel tank of that Boeing 747. Boeing was not willing to accept this because it means casting doubts about the design of the Boeing, about the efficiency of the Boeing. So there is a lot of politics involved in that particular case, which is beyond the scope of this discussion. So I would say that a focus on international aviation law, a focus on the annexures, the renewed approach, which actually will give us insights into these kind of aspects, which are actually crucial to ensuring safety in international aviation, rather than focusing on, the state sovereignty doctrine, or rather than focusing on how the International Civil Aviation Organization is designed, where is its headquarters and such things. In India, I would just, since I mentioned about investigation, let me briefly mention that in India, air crash investigations are governed by the Aircraft Investigation of Accident and Incident Rules 2012. This is similar to the NTSB Act in United States. The 2012 rules actually ensures that all the requirements of Annexure 13 of the Chicago Convention are well incorporated in the legislation. It has actually also created an Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau as per Section 8 of the rules, which is actually responsible for taking care of investigations within India. They work according to the procedures laid down by International Civil Aviation Organization. Central government has been vested with a lot of powers in this case, and there is also a very clear flowchart in terms of the authority, or what we can call an authority gradient. It's actually the central government which will be responsible for every investigation. Within the central government, there is DGCA. Within the DGCA, there is the Investigation Bureau. I'll leave the other details, but I'll say that the investigator who is actually conducting the investigation, there are certain requirements here. So if in NTSB, normally you know that the chief investigator will always be, or in most of the cases will be, a metallurgist who can always find out why the crash happened. In India, we call the investigators the court, and the court will be headed by a person who can be called as headed by a competent person, and the competent person can have certain qualifications, and one of the qualifications mentioned is that legal, aeronautical, engineering, or any other specialized knowledge. And this court, which will actually conduct investigation into the air crashes, will have all the powers of a civil court under Civil Procedure Code. It has also the powers under Indian Penal Code Section 176 to receive a legal response whenever sought. So in India, you can see that there is always a judicial quality to the air crash investigation reports, rather than actually trying to find out what exactly are the reasons of the crash. I'm not at all being critical here about the report. Why it is important to have a legal quality is that the most important safety standard which can be set are the recommendations of the air crash investigation reports, because every crash is a learning. Every crash is a learning of our own mistakes. So it is always good to write the language of these recommendations in the air crash investigation report in a language of normativity, in a language of norms. Now, finally, I would just shift my focus a little bit to the Chicago Convention. Why I'm asking for a major departure from Chicago Convention to the annexures, to the SARBs, and to the SOPs. Number one, Chicago Convention, I said that anybody who approaches Chicago Convention a little thoughtfully will see that, first of all, you find a block. You want to organize civil aviation, you want to transcend the national borders, you want to have a transnational activity, and you are told that every state shall have absolute sovereign rights over its airspace. That means that there shall be no civil aviation across the states. So Chicago Convention starts with this restriction clause, which is a celebration of the absolute state sovereignty doctrine. I told you that the antecedents of this can be traced back to some kind of a cynicism which existed during the First World War and the Second World War. Most of the aviation law drafting happened during this period. So it says that states will have absolute sovereign rights over its airspace. That means the states will continue. And then the rest of the Chicago Convention is in the form of numerous exceptions. It says that, but you can give the states certain freedoms. I'm here talking more about the freedom of overflight, the freedom to have a technical stop, the freedom to fly, the freedom to fly out, the freedom to fly into a second country, collect passengers and cargo, and fly to a third state, the freedom to fly in from a second state to your territory, collect passengers and cargo, and fly out to a third state, the freedom to operate a domestic flight, which is called cabotage, the freedom to operate a domestic flight, collect passengers and cargo from the end destination, and fly out to a foreign state. The right to have the right to fly between two states without ever flying back to your home country, and the right to operate a domestic flight by a foreign airline. So there are 9 such freedoms. Well, this is certainly not the time. In case there are any questions, I'll be glad to tell you which books to read in order to find more details on this. But what I'm saying is that the Chicago Convention starts with a restriction clause, and then the rest of the convention is all about exceptions to that general clause of absolute state sovereignty. Again, when you reach towards the end of the convention, Article 89 states that, but the states will have absolute freedom of action during war and emergency situation. Now, this question, freedom of action, has been debated before International Court of Justice in the India versus Pakistan case, when the jurisdiction of the ICAO Council was challenged by India. In 1971, we imposed an air embargo over Pakistan. Nani Palkhiwala was the Indian counsel. He waxed eloquent in his oral pleadings before the ICJ on what amounts to freedom of action. But my point is not to get into that case. All I'm saying is that if you look at Chicago Convention, you can see that the entire Chicago Convention is sandwiched between the 2 restriction clauses. One is absolute state sovereignty. Another one, you can ignore the convention, you can waive off the convention, or you have the freedom of action without being bound by the convention or its SARBs or the SOBs, without any kind of normative restrictions when there is a war or emergency situation. The last point, I would say that I mentioned that the problem with the sovereignty doctrine is much more serious than what we can imagine. For example, in the case of the ban on the Qatari planes, the siege states, the entire Gulf states said that we are putting a ban on the Qatari planes because there is a risk to our state sovereignty. Now, a doctrine whose imaginations can be traced back to 1648, or the 17th century or the 18th century, is being used actually to restrict the freedom of overflight for a plane. Don't grant freedom of landing, don't grant the freedom of takeoff, but at least you can grant the freedom of overflight. Now, I would like to make more solid arguments for this. One possible argument Qatar can make is that, well, airline is also a market. So you cannot unilaterally impose a ban on us, because if you impose a ban, that amounts to protectionist measures and amounts to a unilateral trade sanction. But unfortunately, nowhere in the WTO canons or in the GATT canons you can find that state sovereignty cannot be invoked in the name of protectionism. So that means that if it is to guard your sovereign rights, you can even race to the bottom. You can adopt protectionist measures, which is what these states have done. Then Qatar can possibly come with this question that, can you really breach a bilateral agreement between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Bahrain, Qatar and Egypt, whereby you have given us the freedom of overflight? Well, the answer to this question is that bilateral is a political arrangement, right? Whatever, if it doesn't suit the interest of the state, if a bilateral is threatening the sovereignty of a state, we can always invoke the bilateral. And bilateral has never been considered as legal in aviation law. They were all political arrangements. So what is the way out? Because on one side, aviation industry is getting badly damaged when a market leader like Qatar is not able to fly its planes. There is a siege, even though now some relief has come, and that's beyond the scope of this through the International Civil Aviation Organization. Now, what is a possible argument? I would say that from a modernist perspective, one way to prevent other states from invoking the state sovereignty doctrine is by saying that breaching of a bilateral is actually a two-party externality. That means that we have entered into a contract and I have never chosen to accept that risk. So you cannot put me in that risk by invoking the two-party externality. Now, in a normative legal approach, two-party externalities do not mean anything, but it's a market sin. If you view that from a market perspective, you cannot, it's an anti-competitive practice, you cannot perform a two-party externality. Public interest, this is a big question. Is public interest important or the sovereign rights of the states? Well, I'm not saying that the sovereign rights of the states are not important, but using state sovereignty doctrine as a means to hinder the public interest or means to thwart the public interest is actually a fundamental problem. My point is neither that Saudi Arabia is right or the Qatar right, but we need to jettison that classicism. The classicism to which we are all slave, which international air law has indoctrinated into us, and move towards this radical newer imagination which I have presented as international aviation law. My last point, the entire reason why this kind of a philosophical reimagination is done is that we need to replace safety as the super norm, not state sovereignty. Let Chicago Convention continue to celebrate it. Let Chicago Convention stay because Chicago Convention is a grand relic. Let Chicago Convention stay. It's a grand cathedral. It's a grand legal architecture. But Chicago Convention will have to be read with a rational way. Now, how to read Chicago Convention with a rational way? Well, some of those rationalist imaginations in public international law emerging in some of the American law schools like Chicago, Harvard, elsewhere have clearly demonstrated us that let's overcome that classicism of public international law at large so that we are able to enliven aviation law as a branch which caters to the day-to-day needs. So I think I've advanced my case here for a clarion call for imagination. I mean, if there are any further questions on this, I'll take it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll be heading on to the Q&A section. I'll start off with this first question, shall we, sir?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So we have a question from Sini Varghese Taragan of 5th year BA LLB from Mar Gregorius College of Law. It's with respect to the recent Air India airplane crash. The sense of liability in two cases. One is the Indian Airlines alone that would be held liable, or will the DXB International Airport management be held responsible? Two, will the Limitation Act apply to it?
All right. I would first of all take a caveat. I'm not the fact finder, so I will not take any sides. I'll simply tell you the law surrounding this case. As a law professor, that's my job, not really to take a call who is liable or not. Now, often in the media, one of the main questions which has been raised is about the legality of the tabletop runways. Now here, again, I would invite your attention to annexures. Annexure 14A of the Chicago Convention deals with aerodromes. So I've mentioned that annexures talk about the standard and recommended practices. So it has two parts. Annexure A talks about aerodromes and Annexure B talks about helidromes. Let's come to the point on aerodromes. Now, Annexure 14 doesn't even use the expression tabletop runways. And that simply means that there is no explicit ban on the tabletop runways. However, there are certain basic standards which every airport will have to maintain. This includes the airport design, and this also includes questions like, about what shall be the length of a runway. So I would say that the only requirement is that if the runway is short, by short here it means that if the runway is anything up to 1,200 meters, or even a little more, so 1,200 meters, then there shall be an area called a runway end safety area. Please note that runway end safety area is in every airport. Airports have been given certain guidelines as to how to design the runway as the runway safety area. We call it actually the RISA, the runway end safety areas. There are 200 and it is required that runway end safety area should be of a certain length. And for Kozhikode Airport, the Calicut Airport at Kozhikode, it is of 240 meters, and that's absolutely not a problem. But the question is actually, how have you designed your runway end safety area? You have to have arresting mechanisms like sand. You shall plow the land and other means of arresting, if any, at the runway end safety area. Now, if my understanding is right, Calicut Airport at Kozhikode did not have that arresting mechanisms there. So there is nothing illegal about the runway there. Tabletop runways are permitted because there are geographical advantages to certain region. If tabletop runways are prohibited, you will never be able to have a suburban airport in Shimla. You can never create airport in Ooty. You can never create airport in many hilly regions all over the world. I mean, there are absolutely landlocked mountainous places where traffic need to, or where air services need to reach. So there is no restriction on the tabletop runway if your runway is 1,200 meters or more or less. You shall have, 1,200 meters is actually considered to be a shorter runway. If you have 1,200 meters, you shall have arresting mechanisms in the runway end safety areas. Now, so that's actually about the legality part. So there are some criticism definitely, and this kind of a question also came in Mangalore. Mangalore also, Mangalore actually the question was not about the tabletop runways. Mangalore, the question was that it took a while for the rescue operators to reach from the tarmac or from the airport terminal to the crash site, because the taxiways were not properly organized, the subways were not properly organized. So the suggestion was mainly that there has to be proper taxiways, proper the allays for the, or proper gateways of the proper routes actually for the safety machineries to reach the crash site. And Mangalore crash, you all know that Mangalore crash, the finding was that it was a pilot error. Now, what was that pilot error? Let me focus on that, and then I'll come to the Calicut, because we can pose similar question. In Mangalore, the black box, otherwise we call it the cockpit voice recorder or the cockpit data recorder, the black box clearly
Hello, sir. I think we have a connection problem.
Pilot was snoring. But now comes the question, can the pilot sleep? Or
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
sorry, there was a brief loss of connection. I hope you can hear me now.
So we have a connection problem. Your connection is breaking.
Yeah.
Hello.
I'm sorry. There was a brief. I hope a brief loss of connection. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's audible.
Can you hear? No.
Yes, I can hear you.
I hope I'm audible. Decision on the part of the pilot. This is, of course, I'm talking in terms of the air crash investigation report, which mentioned that the pilot was snoring. At least the cockpit voice recorder showed that the pilot was snoring. Now comes the question: cannot a pilot sleep? Well, indeed, a pilot can sleep during long-haul flights. So DGCA has issued a guideline called the controlled rest in cockpit. As per the controlled rest in cockpit, definitely if your plane is more than for 3 hours, the pilot can take a controlled rest, but there are certain standard operating procedures which have to be followed. In the case of Bangalore, that was not followed. The pilot woke up 20 minutes before the landing, and the pilot was in a sleep inertia. The sleep inertia actually prompted the pilot to take many wrong decisions, because you need to have the clarity of mind. So the controlled rest in cockpit today, the guidelines clearly mention that the pilot shall wake up 40 minutes before actually even the descent. Forget about land. You have to wake up 40 minutes before even your descent. So that means that you can sleep, but you have to wake up 40 minutes before your cruising ends, and then the landing starts. Now, in this particular case, also now if it's not a question of tabletop runways, if it's not a question, then is the pilot liable? Now here, I would like to, again, I said that I won't take a stance, but I'll simply tell you what the law is. I would like to bring your attention to the operations manual of Indigo, and similar operations manual will be there for Air India Express as well, which talk about how the landing will have to be performed. Number one, it mentions that there are lots of guidelines as to how the landing will have to be performed. No attempt shall be made to unnecessarily float the airplane to achieve a smooth touchdown. Now, you know that when the plane makes a hard landing, depends on the angle, the elevation at which you are landing. Your tire may suffer a lot of wear and tear. Your fuselage may suffer wear and tear if you make a hard landing. So the pilots are given clear instructions that you should plan your approach in a way. It can be either ILS or it can be manual. You have to plan your approach in a way that your touchdown happens right at the touchdown spot, not beyond that. So look at the Indigo's manual. It mentions that in order to make a smooth touchdown, you shall not unnecessarily, float the airplane. So that means that you are supposed to touch down where you have to touch down. Now, after touching down, there are certain braking guidelines, but the braking guidelines vary from pilot to pilot. So initially, right after the touchdown, what the pilots would do, they would put the spoilers. They would put the spoilers. Right after the spoilers, there are pilots who will slightly apply the brake. There are pilots, rather, instead of applying the brake, who would prefer to put the reverse thrust. Now, if you look at the operations manual of Indigo or other airline, there are different levels at which the reverse thrust can also be given, depending upon the need, depending upon the wind, right, to assure a smooth landing. But there is a certain limit. If you do not touch down at the point and you go beyond the touchdown point, all your braking mechanisms will not help. So the options are, I said that spoilers, you can deploy the spoilers, you can put the reverse thrust, you can have tire brakes. you can also burst your tires. But after that, what helps? It's actually, I mentioned that runway end safety area. If there are proper arresting mechanisms, probably the plane will stop there. But if there are no arresting mechanisms, there is no option, but the plane will go and fall into the ditch. That's the law surrounding that. I do not know what caused the crash. The investigation is on, but it would be good to understand this in the light of Annexure 14A. And in the light of some of the operations manual, because there are no touchdown guidelines given, at least in the Chicago Convention or in the annexures. So that's why I had to go to the standard operating procedures. You know many such cases. So in Mangalore, it was very clear. Mangalore, the touchdown was wrong because the first officer has clearly said, let's go around. Our approach is wrong. But the captain overruled it. Now, Mangalore crash is far more instructive than any other case because Mangalore also talked about a deficient cockpit resource management because one was, there was a cultural difference in the cockpit. One was an Indian first officer and a Cypriotic, if I'm not wrong, captain. So the different nationalities, the cockpit resource management, the cockpit training they received in different jurisdictions, everything actually caused to a wrong decision being taken. So I hope I've answered it by narrating the laws surrounding the Calicut crash, but I cannot go take a position here. I do not know.
So we'll have the next question. It's an anonymous question. Will privatization of airports lead to transparency of administration or breeding ground of hooliganism?
Okay, the private airports. The question is on PPPs, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, again, that's a question which is a little bit beyond aviation law, but still let me look at that question from the lens of aviation law. I would say that, you know, if be that public or private, the question is that will there be a proper accountability framework? Because the ultimate norm in aviation is safety. If you can create a framework of accountability, it doesn't matter whether it's a public framework or a private framework. So the efforts need to be on designing that kind of an accountability framework. If the government feels more responsible to the people to ensure that all the standards required for an airport in terms of passenger convenience, in terms of safety can be achieved, a public model is fine. But the belief is that in a private framework, there will be far more accountability. Well, it's not my argument. It is actually arguments of those globalists that, you know, there'll be more accountability in a private framework. So viewing from an aviation law perspective, as long as efficiency in aviation, that means that increased connectivity, increasing profit to the airlines, better service to the passengers. If public interest, safety, and market robustness can be achieved by that, you know, that there is no harm in whichever is the model. What matters is accountability framework.
Right, sir. So there are actually 8 more questions. If you could go through and select the question which you would like to answer.
Well, I'll leave it to you. Probably could just tell me whether there may be overlaps or questions where I can generalize.
Okay, sir. We have a question from Advocate Gio Varghese. There's a protocol that if a delivery of a child happened in the aircraft while flying over USA, the child which is born would get citizenship of America. So which law governs it and where under aviation law does it come under?
Well, that's purely a matter of private international law. It's purely a matter of private international law. But you know that the airplanes like ships have extraterritorial jurisdiction. So certainly, you know that the aircraft is generally deemed to be an Indian territory. And interestingly, there is some guidelines here. I cannot take exactly to, and of course, we do have this fundamental principles of conflict of law, which will ultimately decide which nationality the child will get, irrespective of where the plane is flying. But let me give you this much information that a plane's territory is generally considered to be the territory of the land. And Tokyo Convention mentions that a pilot's authority will end when the doors are opened. So the moment the doors of a plane, the doors are closed, and the moment the doors are opened, the jurisdiction changes. Then the jurisdiction is actually the flag state of the plane becomes the jurisdiction. So otherwise, you know, which nationality the child will get. So when the plane is flying over an American territory, even though the plane's territory is Indian, the plane is actually using the airspace of another state. But again, the fundamental identity, the fundamental geography on which, or the basic geography on which you are located is actually your flag state. I mean, it's purely governed by conflict of law, so I do not know which nationality the child will get. But a plane's territory is an extraterritorial jurisdiction, and a crime committed on board plane will be governed by the law of the land where the plane is registered. Irrespective of a leasing, even though the plane is leased, if the plane is on whose registry the plane is flying, that's the question. Because there are circumstances whereby, you know, leasing is very common. Indigo may be operating a plane leased from Cyprus. In such a particular case, definitely the operator. The operator is actually the flag state, not really the equipment. Right,
sir. Next, we have a question from Rubin John of School of Indian Legal Thought. With the current pandemic situation, do you see any possibility of liability on China under Article 14 of ICAO? Because air travel contributed to transitional spread of the virus. What is the scope of liability considering SARS in Chinese states?
Now, this is a very, very interesting perspective in the light of the pandemic. I refer to about Article 87 of the Chicago Convention. Right. I mean, if you're strictly speaking about liability from an aviation perspective, Chicago Convention doesn't set any liability at all. But interestingly, Chicago Convention gives you certain guidelines as to how in normal, not the new normal, how in a normal civil aviation can operate. Article 89 clearly says that the states have the freedom of action. States have the freedom of action when there is a war or emergency situation. I'm sure that the corona or the pandemic will definitely fall under the definition of emergency. But on the other hand, we can view the same problem, or then again, we can view this from a different perspective, which is that of the robustness of the aviation industry, the need for the movement of the people. Under the Vande Bharat mission, we are flying planes. Right, the Vande Bharat mission. So it also ensures that it's not all about ensuring mobility. It's also about the rescue of the people who are stranded in certain jurisdictions. Allowing the people to come back to their home state is a humanitarian act. And aviation is actually using the kind of exceptions allowed there. But if there is a call, if an airport suspends the taxes, if the overflight charges are reduced during corona, or even we have a solid case actually for demanding that the overflight charges over certain territories can be reduced, there is a strong case for it because Chicago Convention becomes inoperable. Well, I would shy away from calling this inoperable because it rather says that the states have the freedom of action during war or emergency conditions. So civil aviation, you know that the concerns at the moment is not about whether it is legal to bring passengers. Civil aviation is going through a crisis, but there are certain market leaders who have also capitalized to this. For example, you know that Qatar Airways, which was actually under this ban of the siege states, was writhing in pain. Qatar was absolutely about to go into a bankruptcy. At that point, you know that Qatar started to operate all these rescue flights. I mean, now even if you use any flight radar, online flight radar available, you can see that the most of the planes which will be operating would be Qatar Airways, even though aviation is slowly resuming to this. But I would say, I mean, I can only state the legal position, not the political position, whether it is legal to bring it or illegal to bring. During the pandemic, the rules can be relaxed because it permits. Article 89 of the Chicago Convention allows for relaxation of the Chicago Convention, or rather it makes Chicago Convention non-binding upon the states. What shall be your action? Well, I would say that's a rational choice which the states will have to take. Whether you have to bring people, whether you have to still continue with that. I mean, Qatar is continuing, right? I mean, what Qatar has done, that it created a new normal in the airport. It actually completely redesigned, followed social distancing norms within the plane or on board the plane and also in the airport. Qatar still continues to be a good hub. Planes are flying from even Hong Kong to Doha to United States, from Sydney to Doha to London. They are flying. So that's a rational choice which the states will have to take. There is nothing that will regulate a state for operating those flights, and states cannot be held in liable at least under aviation law also for that. But of course, there will be other laws governing for the spread of the pandemic if that's the case.
Right, sir. So next we have question from Ahad Abdul Majid and Maria Josephine. Just a little bit about what does an aviation lawyer do and what is the scope of aviation law in India?
Right. So I've clearly mentioned, I think at some point during my talk, that the job which you will perform in a law firm whereby aviation is a subject matter, it doesn't fall under the scope of aviation law. So most of the students I have taught international aviation law, they come here because they would like to have an international career in international aviation lawmaking. For example, let me tell you what is the best avenue here. So the Institute of Air and Space Law of the McGill University offers an air and space law, an LLM in air and space law. That's one of the finest programs you can find in air and space law, whereby you will be able to learn air and space law in its own fine specialized divisions. Depending on what kind of a job you love. If you love the job of a standard setter, so for example, what is the job actually as a legal officer of ICAO or a legal officer will perform there? The job would be that you will be receiving routine country reports from the states. This will be the complaints report submitted by the states under Annexure 14, because they have to send these routine reports to ICAO. As an ICAO officer, the main responsibility will be to review this. And if there is a breach, you have to get back to the state. Probably the legal advisor might say that, well, that breach is because we have actually exercised our jurisdiction under Article 38, which permits certain deviations from the safety standards. Sometimes you know that. So in India, we have a process called the ICAO Standards Manual. Right, we actually follow this manual in order to mark our disagreements. For example, when it comes to the question of pilot licensing, India follows a slightly different standards than what is required by the ICAO. But as long as you can justify your breach. Now, why not breach, justify your deviation or justify your renewed imagination in terms of those safety standards, it's absolutely fine. Now, you may ask a question, why not standards are absolutely enforceable? Why we are actually even giving a space in terms of enforcing the standard? The answer is that local conditions. Local conditions may require you to breach. So an officer, a legal advisor of the Director General of Civil Aviation certainly would be preparing these compliance reports. Those reports would be sent to ICAO, where another legal officer would be reviewing and getting back to it. This is also an exciting career for those who love dispute settlement in aviation, because ICAO has also a body called the ICAO Council, which engages in some kind of a dispute settlement. But there is big question as to whether it's a court or not. I mean, this matter has even gone up to the International Court of Justice. ICJ judges like Morozov and Nagendra Singh have expressed in strong words the sentiment that, well, we cannot consider ICAO Council as a court because there is no ambience of a trial there. It's simply, a voting by raising hands. So I'm not sure whether it can be really considered as a judicial. As far as litigation is concerned, again, I said that litigation from a pure international aviation law perspective will only happen when the matter is brought to ICAO Council or to the International Court of Justice. For example, the recent case whereby Qatar was, you all know that there was a ban on the Qatar. Qatar immediately approached International Civil Aviation Organization requesting for the lifting of the ban. ICJ said that, well, ICJ was very diplomatic. ICAO was very diplomatic. It did not rule that the ban is lifted, but it suggested that ICAO shall be provided alternative routes. Now, this temporary victory of the Qatar was challenged by the siege states before the International Court of Justice. ICJ ruled that ICAO Council has jurisdiction in this case, and the other states will have to comply with the jurisdiction of ICAO Council. Look at this kind of dispute settlement. This is within the mandate of international aviation law. Decision-making in ICAO, routine decision-making, I'm not saying dispute settlement, decision-making within ICAO, decision-making within national civil aviation, most important, policy making on aviation is a career which certainly one can develop, but for that you need an understanding of not only the aviation law, but also the sector at large. So I would say that in order to develop a career in aviation law, or the first quality you need is you should love planes. This planes have some aesthetic quality about it. That's actually what prompts most of the people. Lots of my students have gone to McGill. They are in the process of completing their LLM, or after completing LLM, they think about a career with an international organization like ICAO. But of course, the job is not guaranteed for anyone. And there are many consultancies whereby aviation related advices are given. Also, the job market lies not just in ICAO, it also lies in agencies like IATA, International Air Transport Association, which is actually an intergovernmental body or an association whereby all the airlines are members. IATA sets standards in terms of ticketing, in terms of boarding passes. So every information you will find in a boarding pass, every new type of check-in procedures you find, they are all based on the standards and the various guidelines issued by the IATA. These guidelines are prepared by the legal minds, and the management minds. A lawyer is always well equipped. A lawyer who understands international aviation law is probably an excellent resource person for the crew resource management to the pilots. Because of course, pilots are the heroes, no doubt. They are the heroes. They are the ones who handle our lives safely. But the crew resource management, a certain kind of a sense of normativity, a sense of legalism will have to be instilled in the minds of the pilots, because the efficiency of a pilot lies in their own adherence to the SOP. The more a pilot follows the SOP, the more the effective pilot they would be. So next time onwards, I know I'm deviating from that. Next time onwards, when your plane is delayed, please be sympathetic. Your pilots are ensuring that the standard operating procedures are fulfilled in your safety.
Right.
So I think I've given an overview of the career and most important academic career. McGill University has dedicated professorships in aviation law. In India too, NALSAR has a Center for International Aviation Law. In Jindal Global Law School, I'm not a professor of aviation law, but I do teach aviation law. There are many professors in India and abroad. Leiden University has a Center for Institute of Air and Space Law. The University of Lapland has an Institute of Air and Space Law. But aviation law is at its up. Yeah, of course, Cologne University in Germany has an Institute of Air and Space Law. So an academic career. I would here say that aviation law or international air law is a discipline which is yet to be approached critically. It needs a little bit of critical inquiry. Some kind of a polemical haunting is needed into the concepts of the discipline. There are many pieces written on aviation law. I myself published on aviation law, but we either talk about the legality of a certain action, we construct our discourse surrounding a certain crash, but actually what we need is a little bit more philosophical inquiries into aviation so that aviation law strives as a robust epistemology.
Thank you, sir. We have a few more questions, but then we acknowledge the questions published. We'll be getting back to you. For now, we'll stop with one last question, sir. This is from Gayatri of 7th SEM BA of Marg Gregorius College of Law. Is emergency landing possible in enemy country? And if there occurs any crash at the time of landing, whether there is legal proceedings related to it? And is there any difficulty with visa problem under aviation law?
Okay, so I have to start a little backward that in Chicago Convention, Article 25 talks about an aircraft in distress. So an aircraft in distress means when the controller is not in control of the plane. For example, the pilot, like who's the controller of the plane, or the commander cannot control the plane when the control is handed over to someone else. Well, I'm not talking about the commander handing over the control to the first officer, but when the plane's control is seized by a hijacker. When the plane is crippled, the crippling can be of any form. It can be an engine failure, it can be a fuel exhaustion, it can also be a bird strike, whatsoever. In such a case, the plane is a plane in distress. Now, immediately that plane will have to make a landing. So what a pilot will immediately do is, under general parlance, the pilot will have to immediately intimate. I've already mentioned that you have to convey a mayday, 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 7700 through the transponder. But if it is not a hijack, sorry, if it is not an engine failure or a technical problem, if it's a hijacking, you shall, to the maximum extent possible, communicate to the controller if you are in a position, because you may be on a gunpoint. If not, you can convey the message to the controller that your plane has been hijacked. Alternatively, you can do 7500 in your transponder. That means that the controller will get that your plane is a hijacked plane. Now, what are the rights of a hijacked plane? Normally, you know that Tokyo Convention says that, or not Tokyo Convention, actually, India has also enacted a legislation called the Tokyo Convention Act of 1975. The law relating to hijacking says that when a plane is hijacked, it is at its safest when it is on the ground. So the state has a responsibility, the state on whose territory a hijacking plane has landed has a responsibility to ensure that the plane doesn't fly again. They have to ensure that the plane remains on the ground, and all the the storming operations, the combing operation will have to be done immediately to save the passengers. But there are instances, you know that the case is the Indian Airlines 812, the plane which was hijacked from Kathmandu and taken to Kandahar. The plane temporarily landed in Indian territory in Amritsar. But 1 hour the plane was in the Indian territory, they were unable to provide any kind of assistance, and the plane has taken off. Now, can India be indicted for this? Later on, the plane landed in Pakistan, and Pakistan also let the plane take off. Can India and Pakistan be indicted? There is an exception to this clause. When the plane is landed, you have to extend maximum support to the plane to ensure that the plane doesn't fly again, unless the life of the passengers are in danger. You know that in Pakistan, what happened was one of the passengers was killed. One of the passengers was killed by the hijackers. So pilot immediately conveyed this to the traffic controllers. There is threat of life, there is loss of life on board the plane, and of course the state will have to allow the plane to take off. So it was, if you ever hear the interviews by Captain Devi Sharan, who flew the plane, you will understand why he had to take off. Something a pilot never wishes, neither from Amritsar nor from Lahore. The pilot wished a takeoff, but of course the plane had to be taken off. Now comes the question. So the plane, you have to provide all assistance to a plane in distress, and it is the duty of a state as per Article 25 of the Chicago Convention. Then I talked about the hijacked plane. Hijacked plane is also plane in distress, which is clearly articulated in the Hague Convention 1970, in the Tokyo Convention 1963, and also in in many domestic legislations. Now, in the Kanishka case, or in the Kandahar hijacking, there was also an incident whereby the Indian pilot had to enter Lahore. He sought permission to land, but the permission for landing was denied. Not only the permission for landing was denied, but also they switched off all the runway lights. Now, this is a clear breach of law. This is a clear breach of the Hague Convention. Pakistan was not supposed to do that. But what did Pakistan say? State sovereignty. Our sovereignty is in danger. Now you see that in what all weird manifestations this classic principle of state sovereignty is coming. An aircraft is in distress, but ultimately Pakistan gave permission for the pilot to land, but the pilot had to perform certain heroics, like showing that he's going to land in a motorway before he finally secured the permission. But Hague Convention and the Tokyo Convention makes it mandatory for the states to give permission for a plane in distress to land. Not only, you don't need to go into those specialized conventions like Tokyo or the Hague. Chicago Convention Article 25 requires all assistance to be given to a pilot. Now, the distress can come in different forms. I've said that. If you ask the question whether Captain Sullenberger was in a better position or Captain Devi Sharan, well, Captain Sullenberger had a crippled plane, both the engines off. But Captain Sharan had a well-functioning plane, but he was on gunpoint. So you can see that both the pilots were in some sort of distress, but these are two acts of heroics. Amazing pilotship, both landed the plane to the safety. But there are also cases where, unfortunately, pilots could not land. For example, Ethiopia 953, the pilot was on gunpoint. They were amateur hijackers who did not know that the plane is running out of fuel. Despite pilots' repeated cautioning, they still asked the plane, which was originally flying from Nairobi to Addis Ababa to Nairobi, to fly to Australia. I mean, the plane didn't have the fuel for that. The plane crashed. Pilot survived, but of course, he saved at least half of the passengers in the plane. There are numerous such acts of heroics. But law requires the plane to be given all assistance, because if you look at also the discourse on international terrorism, why planes are easy targets? I mean, this is also a question you have to ask. Number one, there is a certain vulnerability to the plane. And I think you as airline passengers, I can tell you that vulnerability, the moment the plane lifts off, that when the moment the pilot rotates the plane, the nose goes up and the planes take off, you as a passenger, if you have not sensed that vulnerability, you probably have never enjoyed your flight. Because the moment the plane lifts off the ground, you can feel that vulnerability within the plane. But then you have this confidence that this is under the command of somebody whose dispositions the plane will obey, well, whose dispositions the pilot know. Second point is you have to see that planes generally, the conventional discourse is that planes are high-profile flying objects, or only high-profile people travel in plane. People who probably who have a larger stakes in the public. Well, I'm not saying this is a right perception, but generally, that one who flies a plane, they are considered to be some sort of an elite. So these two perceptions, because that if elites are damaged or high-profile people are involved, then probably that it would be easy to make a negotiation. These are the two things which actually make a plane the easy targets. But it's unfortunate because you are actually making civilians, innocent civilians, the target of your covered eyes in order to get some of your covered claims achieved, or your act of covered eyes in order to achieve some ulterior motives or ulterior goals. So the simple point is that a plane is a vulnerable object. I said that there are 1,000 things which can go wrong, but there is one way everything can go wrong. So law binds on the states, law makes it obligatory on the states to provide all assistance to the airplanes.
Right. With this, we come to the end of the amazing session. I now invite a faculty member, Ms. Sushma George, to say a few words of gratitude.
Good afternoon to everyone. It's been a real pleasure listening to our speaker, Professor Srijit, speak on the philosophy of international aviation law. I'm here to take a few minutes of yours to just thank everyone associated with today's event. To begin with, I extend a special thanks to Professor Srijit himself, who's been very kind enough to accept our invitation. On a niche area such as aviation law, it's always a pleasant experience to have an experienced person walk us through the nuances of the subject. So your remarks on everything from reimagining the sources of aviation law as well as reconsidering the state sovereignty doctrine is something that we've flagged up for consideration on a continuous basis. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and on behalf of Mar Gregorius College of Law, I once again thank you for your valuable effort and contribution to this session, and we look forward to further associations with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Secondly, I wish to thank our college management and leadership, particularly Professor Dr. John Sir, our principal, and Reverend Dr. Koshi Isaac Punamutal, our director, for encouraging us to go forward with these sort of interactions with national level resource persons. Thank you, sir and father, for your generous guidance and support in the preparations for the webinar, without which this wouldn't have appeared on the calendar. Thank you. And I would also like to thank all our faculty members for their cooperation with this event, particularly Jisa ma'am, who in all her goodwill introduced us to Professor Srijit, Ria ma'am for all the supportive assistance and initiative, and Vinulal sir for inexhaustible reserves of energy to secure the back end, the technical arrangements relating to this webinar. Our students have contributed no less to the webinar. They have been active participants, making arrangements for all sorts of events. So thank you, students. And finally, I end with gratitude to all our almost 160, 180 participants who joined in to make the interaction enriching. As is the case with every inspiring academic activity, participants will no doubt remain hungry for more. So with that, I thank you all and have a good afternoon. A small note to the participants, please make sure that you sign the you log in and enter the feedback form to mark your attendance for the event. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking time out of your valuable schedule to present to us this knowledgeable, engaging, and enlightening session. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just like to acknowledge the kind invitation extended by my dear friend and classmate, Professor Jizamor. Had it not been for her, probably I would not have been able to give this speech. Thank you to the college at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Before leaving, please make sure that you fill the feedback form. Thank you all for joining with us today. Hope to see you again in the upcoming webinars.